The wind tore through the cedar brakes and skidded low over the snow, hunting the bones of anything foolish enough to still draw breath. Smoke leaned sideways out of every chimney in the valley below, thin as thread, and at that late hour, not one man dared ride the ridge. They had all gone to ground, in plank cabins, dugouts, stone huts braced with moss. Every one of them had mocked her, the widow with the sickly baby and her ridiculous cabin walls stitched from trash and mud, a woman building with scraps of waxed paper and bark mulch, talking about insulation like she was some factory man from back east. But that was before the winter changed, before the freeze came down hard in December and stayed clenched like a fist into February. Now they only whispered her name. They didn't even know it. They just called her the cardboard widow. 3 months earlier, there had been no snow, no wind, and no pity. It was mid-autumn when she rolled into their settlement, a rail-thin woman in brown cloth, eyes deeper than her years, clutching a bundle that coughed through the night and barely made a sound in the morning. She had no man beside her, no wagon of her own, just a wheelbarrow half covered by stitched-together flour sacks, and a baby not older than 6 weeks swaddled in her coat. She said her name was Eleanor, no last name. No one asked further. They didn't need to. They saw the hollows in her cheeks, the blue tinge on the child's lips, and the raw skin on her hands where the seams of her gloves had split and been sewn again too many times. She had nothing, not even shelter, but she had the baby, and she had the hill. It wasn't much of a hill, just a bald spot rising out of the spruce with a view of the tree line and a trickle of creek below. But it was dry, and the soil was loose enough for digging. Everyone figured she'd scrape together a dugout like the rest of the poor ones, or maybe lean-to boards with moss and prayer. Instead, she walked from cabin to cabin collecting discards, old crates, broken shipping boxes, lining from supply barrels, paperboard from wrapping bolts of cloth, waxed canvas from abandoned tents, slats from packing trunks, and string. Always string. The widow wanted trash. When Mrs. Hull tried to hand her a patch of good canvas tarp, Eleanor said, "No thank you, I need something thin, something that traps heat, something with air in it." The townsfolk didn't understand it, didn't want to. Most figured she'd gone soft from the fever, or had some city-born delusion about what kept a baby warm, but she built anyway. She worked alone, always near dusk, always with one eye on the child sleeping in a canvas wrap inside the wheelbarrow. She laid a frame low in the dirt using a narrow trench of hand-hacked spruce, notched carefully together with a battered hatchet. From there, she layered. The outside walls weren't wood, not in the traditional sense. They were tightly pressed layers of paperboard, soaked and dried, glued together with flour paste and moss lichen, wrapped in waxed cloth, and again sealed with thin bark mulch and a final skin of horsehide pulled from a rotting carcass the dogs had left behind. The thing looked ridiculous. It sagged in places. It crinkled when the wind pushed against it, and it smelled faintly of paste and spoiled milk, but it held. By early November, the little cabin had a sloped roof with a thick inner chamber, a single room sunk half into the hill, and reinforced with hollow layers of sealed air. Someone muttered she was trying to make a bread oven for herself. Another called it cardboard witchcraft. And then it snowed. The first snow didn't stay. Neither did the second. But the third came on November 30th, and with it came the wind. That was the night the child almost died. Old Harv Meyer, who lived closest to the ridge, heard it first. The knocking, not a hand, a stone. A woman banging a stone against his cabin door in the dark. When he pulled it open with his shotgun half drawn, he found Eleanor weeping, baby in her arms, her shoes filled with blood and snow. She begged no words, just held the child out in front of her. Harv was hard but not cruel. He took them in, for a night, laid the child near the fire, let Eleanor cry with her head against the floorboards. By morning the boy was breathing again, and Eleanor was already standing. "I need sealant," she said. Harv blinked. "Tree pitch, clay if you've got it, rags if not." She thanked him and hobbled out without waiting for permission. They saw her on the ridge that next afternoon, crawling over her own roof like a beetle, forcing pitch into every seam, hammering flat slats over corners with the heel of a boot wrapped in scarf. The snow hit harder that night, and the night after, but she didn't come back to Harv's store again. 2 weeks passed. The storm worsened. She didn't come into town. People muttered. Then came the scream. It was December 14th, when little Sarah Greer went missing, 7 years old, too thin, always coughing. She'd wandered outside when her father fell asleep drunk by the stove. They searched until dusk, lanterns swinging, voices shouting. It was the widow who brought her back. At dawn, the child was bundled in double cloth, still coughing, but warm. She'd spent the night inside the cardboard cabin. Her first words to her mother weren't about fear. She said, "It's so warm in there. It smells like bread." The townsfolk didn't believe it, not at first, until the blizzard came proper, and the real cold began. December 19th, the storm broke trees in half, screamed like a god through the valley. Chimneys burst, dugouts cracked, children cried all night with blue fingers, and old men huddled in bedrolls to keep their hearts from slowing. It was worse than any winter they'd seen in 20 years. Only 3 homes still had steady heat. One was the mayor's, one was the apothecary's, and one was the cardboard cabin. Eleanor didn't invite anyone, but she didn't turn them away either. When the second baby was found half frozen near the well, she took it in. When the schoolteacher's roof fell in, she opened her door. By Christmas, 4 people had joined her inside that single chamber. By New Year's, there were 7 men, women, a child, even a mutt from the greengrocer's shed, and not one of them shivered. She used steam pots, tin bowls of boiled snow, heated with flat stones and packed under the bed. She had layered heat traps, walls within walls, using sealed paper, cloth, ash-lined parchment. And somehow, the strange insulation she built from scavenged board and moss not only held heat but magnified it. The cabin breathed warmth. No one understood it, no one could, but they stopped laughing. That winter killed a dozen in the county. It collapsed 6 roofs. It froze the stream into a jagged white path that didn't thaw until March. But not one soul in the cardboard cabin so much as lost a toe. Even the newborn, Eleanor's boy, grew fat on goat's milk and slept through the final blizzard. And when spring came, they dug the cabin up from the snow like an artifact. Not one layer of bark had peeled. Not one draft had crept in. She'd built a miracle from scraps, and for the first time they called her by her name. "Miss Eleanor," one of the children said. "How'd you know how to build it like that?" She said nothing for a moment, just looked down at the boy in her arms. Then softly, "You build different when someone's breath depends on it." When spring came to the valley, it didn't come gently. It broke in like a thief. Sudden thaws, runoff slicing through the lowlands, and sleet slapping roofs like a last insult from winter's retreating hand. The snow melted, but not all at once. It sagged and crumbled. It flooded basements and tipped fences. Trees groaned under their own weight, and every step outside sank a boot ankle deep into mud that sucked and held. But the cardboard cabin stood firm. They watched it, those that had mocked her, watched it emerge from the thaw like a relic. The paperboard walls weren't warped, the waxed layers hadn't peeled. The moss stayed green beneath the sheeting, and the bark had darkened into a seal tighter than glue. It wasn't a shack anymore, it was a structure, a thing that had worked when stronger homes failed. And so word spread, not in stories, in whispers. The widow's name, Eleanor, came back into mouths that had only known her as a curiosity or joke. Mothers asked about her method. Men paced the edges of her hill, eyeing her walls like they were church altars. Even Mr. Reeve, who sold timber and once called her cabin a coffin made of trash, now came round with a folded scrap of parchment in his hand. He asked to see inside. Eleanor stepped from the doorway, her face unreadable. She didn't speak. She simply opened the door and let him look. What he saw changed everything. It wasn't just warm. It was regulated. There was no visible chimney, yet the air inside was breathable. The central hearth had been built from salvaged stove brick, layered with metal plates, thin enough to heat quickly, insulated enough to hold heat for hours. The stove was built sunken, with a small trough lined in polished tin running toward the wall, where heat vented through a slit under the eave, pulling in cold air and cycling warmth downward. A passive draft system. No one in town had seen anything like it. Eleanor's heat didn't rise and vanish. It curled, clung low, then rose slowly through the layered insulation. The walls within walls were built like lungs, paper sealed against air, bark and moss for breathability, waxed hide for water resistance, and clay-patched joints smoothed with ash paste. Heat circled instead of escaping. Even the floor was hollow, packed with rags and straw and sealed tight. The wind didn't touch it. Reeve came out red-faced. He didn't say a word, but he came back the next day with offers. They all wanted a piece now. She could have made money, could have turned her odd construction into a business, could have taken a team of men and built copies across the ridge. But Eleanor said no, every time. "I built it for the baby," she'd say. Some believed she was selfish, others thought her prideful, but most understood in time that what she meant was simpler. It wasn't about the cabin, it was about survival. No one else would have believed in it the way she had, and not one of them had a reason to build the way she did, with desperation in every stitch, with her child's rattling breath the only compass. Then came Henry. They hadn't seen the man before. He came in with the freshets, riding a chestnut mare half-starved and wearing boots that still held Texas dust. He had the kind of face that told you nothing. Not young, not old, not welcoming, not cruel, just steady. His coat was city-cut but weather-worn, and the first thing he did upon riding in wasn't go to the saloon or general store. It was follow the ridgeline toward the cardboard cabin. Eleanor saw him coming from the door. She didn't flinch. She didn't wave. She simply stepped outside and waited. The others watched from the valley, from their porches, their sheds, their window slits. The whole town had started walking a little quieter around her hill since the blizzard, not with fear, with something closer to reverence. So when this stranger came up and spoke to her, not just spoke, but walked with her around the cabin, there were whispers again. Some thought he was a government man, some thought a suitor, but he wasn't either. His name was Henry Mercer, and he worked for the Bureau of Western Infrastructure out of St. Louis, a quiet new initiative funded by industrial families who had grown nervous watching the death toll of every frontier winter rise year after year. He'd been sent to record innovations in homesteading, to scout unconventional solutions. And Eleanor's cabin, word of it had reached farther than anyone knew. Even to him, he stayed 3 days, asked gentle questions, measured things without touching, slept in a lean-to, even when invited to a proper house in town. He said he needed to see how the cabin held warmth from inside and out. On the second morning, he watched the baby wake up and stretch inside that strange sealed warmth. Cheeks pink, hands splayed, eyes blinking like he'd never known cold. Henry's own boots were damp from frost, and he hadn't slept a full hour without shivering. He said nothing at first. Then, that night, he spoke. "I'd like to document it," he told Eleanor. She said, "You can look," but he shook his head. "Not just look, share it, publish it. Get your methods into hands that'll use them." Eleanor didn't answer. She sat quietly by the hearth, stirring a pot of boiled oats and greens, the baby cooing near her feet. Then softly, "If they had a baby, they wouldn't need my paper. They'd find a way." He left the next morning, but not before she gave him something. A single drawing, a layout sketch, done in coal on parchment, a diagram of the wall layers, nothing else. He took it with both hands, folded it into his coat, and said, "Thank you, Miss Eleanor." She nodded once, and Henry Mercer disappeared down the road, leaving behind nothing but hoofprints and questions. The spring deepened. Children played again in muddy yards. Men hauled timber to rebuild roofs, and the town began talking about the next winter, about stoves, about insulation, about Eleanor's method. But Eleanor wasn't rebuilding. She wasn't expanding. She stayed in her hill cabin, planting a narrow trench of greens beside the west wall, her child always wrapped to her chest. The baby was stronger now, no longer coughing. He laughed sometimes, which took people by surprise. The cabin had held more than heat. It had held hope. Then, in early June, a box arrived. No one knew where it came from. No wagon, no postman. It simply sat at the base of Eleanor's hill one morning, sealed in waxed string. She opened it slowly. Inside was a book, a thick-bound ledger. No title on the front, just stamped letters on the first page. Pioneering Modern Heat Traps. Case Studies in Survival, and under that, Chapter 1, The Cardboard Widow's Cabin. Below that was a sketch, her sketch, and beneath it a printed note. "This knowledge may save lives." Eleanor stared at the page for a long time. Then she did something no one had seen her do since that first cold night in November. She smiled. But the story didn't end there. It never does. Because the cabin, for all its miracle, was not invincible. The baby grew, the seasons turned, and not every winter would be like the last. It was the next freeze that tested her most, not because of snow, not because of cold, but because of fire. The cardboard cabin never caught fire in the way people imagined cabins burned, with sparks from a stove or careless candlelight or some vengeful act of God. It happened faster, stranger. And not from within. It began with smoke that wasn't hers. That second winter came harder than the first, colder in the mornings, longer between thaws, and meaner in how it sank into the bone. Men who'd braved the last season with grit now checked and rechecked their chimneys every dusk. Mothers who once mocked Eleanor's layered walls were now stuffing sacks with sawdust and nailing them to their windows. Still, few had what she had. None could hold the warmth the way she could. And so, with more mouths to feed, more fires burning low, and panic nipping at the heels of pride, someone grew reckless. They lit a pine stove before clearing it, used greenwood soaked in pitch oil, let the flue clog. The fire took the Grierson place first, then the roof of the tiny schoolhouse. And by the time the flames ran wild across the edge of town, fanned by cruel northern wind, the fire had turned from accident to something ravenous. It climbed the ridge like a starving thing, and Eleanor's cabin stood directly in its path. She didn't panic. That's what people would say later. over and over, with that strange reverence that creeps into men's voices when they speak of those they never understood. She didn't shout, didn't scream, just wrapped the child and moved. Harv Meyer saw it from his porch, said she stepped out onto her slope, eyes on the flames coming up like fingers through the timber, and disappeared into the ground. That was the part no one could explain, how she disappeared, not ran, not climbed, but vanished. They found out later she'd dug a crawl space, a cold chamber, shallow but dry, beneath the western slope of the hill, a kind of emergency hollow, framed with waxed bark, clay-lined, and sealed with what looked like old iron sheeting from some forgotten mining camp. It wasn't meant to be lived in. It was a contingency, a last resort, and it saved her life. The fire reached the cabin by nightfall. It lit the north side, ran down the waxed bark like a wick, and hit the outermost wall. But it didn't behave the way fire was supposed to. It slowed, staggered. The soaked paperboard didn't catch quickly. The moss she'd sealed into the gaps held water even after weeks of cold, the very thing they'd mocked. The absurd layering, the mixed materials, the stubbornness of her design. It bought her minutes, enough to crawl deep, to pull the metal hatch shut, to wait. When the cabin finally gave, it didn't explode in light. It sagged, collapsed inward, smoke first, then ash, a quiet fall. By morning it was gone, but she wasn't. The sun hadn't fully risen when she emerged, covered in black soot, eyes swollen red, her coat charred at the hem, and the child still pressed to her chest, breathing slow and steady. She didn't speak, didn't ask for help. She just stepped over the ruined slope and stood where the door had once been, staring at what was left. The others came later, one by one. Word had spread fast. They didn't approach her at first. What could they say? What words mend that kind of loss? She had built something beyond comprehension, and it was gone. Except it wasn't. While they stood there, a strange sound broke through the silence. Clink, 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 metal on stone. They turned. It was Eleanor, digging. She hadn't even taken off the child's wrap, had him bundled on her back, swaying slightly as she shoveled into the ash. Someone tried to stop her. "Miss Eleanor, please! It's still smoking!" But she didn't stop. Clink, clink, clink. She dug until she hit it. The sunken hearthstone, still intact, scorched but unbroken. She knelt down, touched it with both hands like she was greeting an old friend. Then she stood and turned to face the crowd, and finally spoke. "I'll rebuild it, right here. Better this time." Nobody laughed. Not anymore. That spring became legend in town, not for the fire, but for what followed. Eleanor did rebuild, but not alone. It began with small offerings, strips of waxed canvas, old window glass, flattened tin from tobacco boxes, pieces of flue pipe, even a square of slate someone had once used for roofing. One by one, settlers brought their scraps to her hill. Then the children came, with buckets of bark mulch and dry moss. Then the old men, hauling lumber they couldn't use. Then Mrs. Hull, with a bundle of linen. By the end of the week, the ridge looked like a supply depot. But Eleanor didn't rush. She studied, measured. She spent 3 weeks testing wall layers again, burning small samples, sealing others, using animal fat and birch tar to make waterproof paste. The baby, now just over a year old, sat watching her from a basket as she worked. He babbled now, played with twine, and laughed when wind hit his face. By June, the foundation had been redrawn. By August, the new cabin was half built, and by the first frost of October, it was ready. This time, it wasn't hidden. It wasn't humble. It was deliberate. From a distance, it looked almost the same, a low structure pressed into the hillside, narrow roof, shallow footprint. But up close, it was different in every way. Twin-layered floors with insulated ducts beneath, thin sheet glass windows packed with wool-lined shutters, a re-engineered hearth with an outer chamber to burn waste smoke before it escaped. And the walls were a work of madness and genius. 9 layers, yes 9, each with a function. Paperboard for compression, waxed cloth for moisture, air gap for heat buffering, lichen-lined slats to absorb water vapor, a mix of sawdust and clay sealed tight against wind, reeds crushed into matting, iron, sheeting scavenged from the apothecary roof. More paper, more bark. The thing shouldn't have stood, but it did. It stood tall. Henry Mercer returned in November. No horse this time, just a cart and a helper from back east. He said he'd heard about the fire, that a drawing of Eleanor's new wall design had made it into a medical journal in Chicago. Not for architecture, he said. For field hospitals? She didn't seem surprised. He spent a full week sketching the new cabin, writing down materials, asking again for permission to publish it in detail. This time, she said yes. And when he asked what he should call it, she paused, then said, "Just say it was made for a baby. That's the reason it works." That second winter came down even crueler. Harder winds, less sun, more deaths in nearby settlements. But the town on the ridge, they made it through. 6 families had rebuilt using Eleanor's methods. None lost a soul. There's a picture they still show in a museum 3 states over, a black and white photograph, faded at the edges. It shows a woman in a long coat, soot on her cheeks, holding a baby on her hip, standing in front of a cabin with strange textured walls and no chimney in sight. Below it, the placard reads, "The Cardboard Widow, How One Woman Redefined Frontier Survival." But back then, in that second winter, she was just Eleanor. And when someone finally asked her why she didn't just move, didn't go back east or find a town with buildings and bricks and real stoves, she looked at them for a long time, then said, "Because I buried him here." The man looked startled. "Buried who?" And Eleanor softly, "My husband, right under the ridge." She pointed to a spot by the lowest tree. "He built me a fire once, when I was sick, sat with me for 3 days without sleep. Kept saying, 'Heat is life, Ellie. Don't ever forget.'" She looked back at the cabin. I didn't forget. They never knew she was pregnant again. Not until the baby came. Not until midwinter. Not until the winds were louder than sermons, and the creek below her cabin had turned into a vein of frozen black. The snow had already swallowed every track, and even the bravest settlers wouldn't climb her ridge after sunset. No one saw her belly swell beneath the coat. No one thought to ask why she stopped coming down to the main street for supplies. No one heard her cry out when the pain came, or how long she labored alone inside the heat-trap cabin she had built not just to preserve warmth, but now, as it turned out, to preserve life. The child was born during the coldest week of the year, a daughter. Eleanor named her Grace, and Grace never once felt cold. By then, the new cabin had already become legend. Children pointed at it like it was a temple. Men with frostbite studied it from the tree line and walked home shaking their heads. Families too proud to ask for help still fashioned mock replicas in their root cellars, stuffing flour sacks with mulch and layering wax over bark, trying to guess how she did it. But they never got it quite right, because it wasn't the materials, it wasn't the layers, it was how she used them, and why. There was love in the seams, desperation, yes, but something else too, something that couldn't be diagrammed. Still they tried. A letter arrived from Kansas City, then another from Denver, then 2 from universities back east. They wanted her story, her designs, her measurements. One offered to bring her eastward, with the child, of course, and promised a warm carriage, city lodgings, and any medical treatment she might require. Eleanor didn't even open the second page. She tore the letter, tossed it into the stove, and watched it turn to smoke. The baby grew. She didn't cry at night like her brother once had, didn't fuss in the chill. Eleanor wrapped her twice in paper-lined cloth and laid her near the center of the cabin, where heat collected like breath in a cupped hand. At night, Eleanor sat cross-legged with both children beside her, humming softly, eyes half closed, hands forever working, weaving, sealing, sewing new insulation from whatever scraps still came her way. And in those quiet months, the cabin became more than shelter. It became memory, because Eleanor began to change. The others noticed first. Her visits to town were shorter, her cheeks thinner. She no longer walked with her shoulders upright. She stooped slightly, like the cold was inside her now, no matter the heat. Some said it was just age. Others said the weight of 2 winters like that would bow any woman. But Mrs. Hull knew better. She saw it in the eyes, the way Eleanor looked at her children with an urgency that didn't quite match her slow steps. Then the coughing started, not from the children, from her. It wasn't a loud cough, not a sickbed gasp or the kind that came with fever. It was quiet, dry, but constant. And when the spring thaw came late and the doctor finally climbed the ridge, Eleanor wouldn't let him inside. "I'm fine," she said. He nodded, but left a vial of tincture at the foot of her steps anyway. By summer, the cough was gone, but so was Eleanor's voice. She didn't speak much that season, just gestures, nods, a hand on a shoulder, a small smile. Her son, now just over 2, had learned to speak in whispers, the way his mother did. Grace babbled, crawled, then walked, all within those quiet months. The cabin remained the same, warm, clean, tightly sealed, but something in the air had shifted, like time moved different inside it now. And then the letters stopped coming, not because the world had forgotten, but because they knew, they understood she wasn't coming east, that she had no interest in publishing or lecturing or anything beyond that slope and those 2 children. Eleanor had built her final hearth, and she intended to stay beside it. Then came the 3rd winter. It arrived early. October snow, September winds, August nights that chilled like frost-bitten fingers. The settlers panicked. They had time to prepare, yes, but they knew, somehow, that this freeze would be worse. Worse even than the fire year. Worse than the first. Wood was hoarded. Blankets traded like coin. Children pulled from school to help seal windows. But most of all, they looked to the ridge. They looked to Eleanor, to the cardboard widow, and they began to build. They didn't ask for her help. They didn't dare, but they copied everything they could, using notes from memory, diagrams passed between hands. One man claimed to have traced the interior of her cabin in his dreams. Women lined floors with bark soaked in paste. Windows were replaced with layers of waxed cloth nailed into hoops. Root cellars were sealed with clay-padded paperboard and straw. Chimneys were fitted with baffles built from tin and ash paste. And then the winds came. The blizzard struck in November. 4 feet of snow in 3 days. 2 roofs collapsed. A wagon got buried mid-ride and was never found. But in the cabins built like hers, they endured. Barely. On the 4th night, the mayor's youngest son went missing. Ran off in the dark. No coat. A fever dream. The mother was screaming. A group of men lit lanterns, but the snow was falling so fast it swallowed light. They gave up by dawn. But then a shape came walking down the ridge. Not a man, a child, carried in the arms of a woman, wrapped in triple cloth. The boy, pale and half-conscious, blinked slowly as the townsfolk gathered. And the woman, wrapped in grey, ash in her hair, placed the boy in his mother's arms, nodded once, and turned to walk back uphill. They realized too late it was Eleanor. She hadn't spoken, she hadn't looked back. Mrs. Hull ran after her, reached the base of the ridge and shouted her name into the wind. No answer, no shape above, just snow, just smoke curling faintly from that low, chimneyless roof. By the time the thaw came, later than ever, deep into March, the town had changed. It was quieter, slower, but it had also learned. No one died that winter, no one. It was the first time since the settlement began that a freeze didn't take a soul, and when the first green broke through the snow, children ran up the ridge to visit the woman who had built the home that saved them. But the door was open, and the cabin was empty. Inside, everything was in place. 2 beds, a warm stove, a table set for 3, but the hearth was cold. No ashes, no scent of smoke, just stillness. And on the bed, a folded scrap of parchment. It read, "Heat is life. Now it's yours to keep." The children had been taken, not stolen, not hidden, given to Mrs. Hull. A letter had arrived in her cabin 3 days earlier from Eleanor saying goodbye, asking for care, trusting no one else, and a deed had been filed with the notary. The cabin and the land were now public, to be preserved, used, shared. They never found her body. Some say she walked into the woods and laid beside her husband. Some say she moved on to another ridge, another place where no one knew her name, to build again. Some say she was just tired, not of winter, but of being needed by everyone except herself. But every spring the town gathers at the cabin. Children run their hands over the strange walls, asking if it's true. Their parents nod, and someone always whispers, "She built it for a baby. That's why it worked." Spring came with wet air and soft ground, and the ridge bloomed yellow with early wildflowers. The stream ran high and loud again, cutting through the thawing dirt below the cabin like a silver ribbon, unspooled by unseen hands. But even as the town shook off winter like a dog shedding water, the cabin on the hill stayed still, untouched. No smoke, no sound. The door left unlocked, just as she had intended. Mrs. Hull took the children home the morning after the thaw. She found them asleep in their coats near the hearth. Grace curled up in the crook of her brother's arm, both of them wrapped in paper-lined cloth and warm as summer. Eleanor was gone. The cabin was in perfect order. She hadn't left in a rush. She had planned it. The townsfolk came up later in 2s and 3s, not to pillage or steal, but to look, to understand. Some cried quietly at the threshold, unsure why. Others just stood a while, then walked away, shaking their heads. And so the cabin became a monument, not by declaration, no brass plaque, no proclamation from a mayor, no carved stone at the foot of the hill. It became sacred in the way only useful things can, lived in, leaned on, passed from hand to hand like fire in a storm. The town changed its name within a year. The old name, Huntsbridge, was faded, half-remembered, tied to a founding family long gone east. The new name was a whisper that had circled the ridge for years already. Cardboard Hollow. 10 years passed. Children grew. The town didn't become a city, not quite, but it flourished. It found balance. Wood stoves gave way to better ones. Roofing improved. But the warmth of that cabin stayed unmatched. Engineers came, architects, men with glasses and clipboards and rolled-up sketches. They all walked up to the ridge and took notes. They all asked to buy the land. They were all refused. The deed was communal now, registered in the town's name, bound by a charter drawn up by Mrs. Hull and 3 other settlers who had watched Eleanor build it with their own eyes. The cabin would remain public, open to all, free, but not as a museum, as shelter. The only rule was this: anyone cold can stay. In the 11th year after Eleanor's disappearance, a woman arrived with twins, thin, blue-lipped, coughing. No money, no man, just hope and desperation. She was led to the ridge. They gave her matches. They didn't explain anything else. She opened. the door, lit the stove, slept on the bed Eleanor had left. Her children slept too, and when she came down a week later, she said, "It was warm in a way I didn't expect, like the walls were breathing for us." And so the legend held. By the 15th year, the story had spread wide again. Articles were written. An illustrator published a children's book called The Paper House on the Hill, which showed Eleanor as a tall, gentle ghost who wrapped babies in bark and fed them fire from her palms. The townsfolk didn't argue. They didn't correct it. But inside, they remembered her as she truly was. Tired, sharp-eyed, hungry and yet unflinching, her voice soft, her hands steady, her warmth deliberate. Grace turned 16 that year. She didn't look like her mother much. Her hair was darker, her shoulders broader. But when she stood on the ridge, her eyes scanning the trees like they were trying to speak to her, people noticed something quiet in her expression. One morning she returned to the cabin alone, unlocked the door, and stayed 3 days. No one followed. When she came back, she brought blueprints, 3 drawings, labeled carefully. Mobile heat shelter, based on my mother's work. She wasn't a child anymore, and neither was her brother. He had taken to woodwork and had learned to shape bark so thin it could be layered and waxed like parchment. They began building small things together: heat panels, stove traps, window liners. They never asked for money, but soon others began offering it anyway. And then something bigger happened. In the 20th year after Eleanor's disappearance, a second cabin was built, not beside the first, but 2 towns over. From her plans, from her materials, from the same dirt even. They'd asked for a small amount from the hilltop to seed the hearthstone, though no one really believed that changed anything. Still, it worked. That cabin kept 6 people alive through a flash snow, and word spread again. There was no longer a need to convince anyone. No one laughed anymore. Even the old timberman admitted it. She knew something we didn't. And by then, what had started as a desperate structure built for one child had become a method taught in workshops across 3 territories. They called it the Eleanor Layer. Grace never sought credit. She never toured. She never stood on stages or wrote speeches. But when someone asked her, in a letter from a university that wanted her to lecture, she replied only with this: "My mother built with love, not pride, so I build quietly." By the 30th year, the cabin still stood, untouched, still sealed, still dry, its walls still layered with the fingerprints of a mother who built not with tools, but with terror and tenderness bound into one. Visitors came, some from cities, some from far mountains, some just walked the ridge in silence, like pilgrims. One carved this into a stone beside the steps. She gave warmth to strangers. That was enough. And then one last thing happened. Something quiet, something not spoken of in newspapers or stories. It was a summer morning. Clear skies, birds in the trees, children playing in the creek, and a boy, maybe 12, with crooked teeth and 2 short sleeves, walked up to the cabin on a dare. His friends waited at the bottom, snickering, calling him coward. He stepped up, placed his hand on the old door, and as he did, before he opened it, the door creaked slightly, just an inch, not from his touch, from the inside. He swore later it opened on its own. No one believed him. But when the townsfolk went up that night to check, the door was open just wide enough to see inside. And the hearth? It was glowing, dimly, softly, as if someone had just been there, as if the heat had returned, as if, maybe, it had never left. And so they shut the door gently. They didn't lock it. They never did. Because the rule still stood. Even now, anyone cold can stay.